Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Dissecting the Truth Case Files Uncovered. Now in today's episode, as you can notice, we're in a different location and we'll be in this location for like 2 weeks, but then after that it will be back to the normal location. Like I said last week, we are doing the case of Theodore Robert Bundy. He's a very infamous serial killer. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe and let me know down below what your thoughts are on this case. Without much ado, let's get into the video. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on the 24th of December 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. His mother's name was Louise Cowell, and she gave birth to him at the age of 22 in a home for the unwed mothers. It's not completely sure who's Ted's biological father is. On Ted's birth certificate, the name that is there is a Lloyd Marshall. But Louise did later come out and say that it could have also been a 30-year-old former Air Force pilot. But then Louise also did come out again later and say that it was a sailor by the name of Jack Worthington. So the true identity of Ted's father was never and still is not known because both Jack and Lloyd have denied having any sexual involvement with Louise. Even though Ted didn't have a relationship with his biological father, he did actually have two father figures throughout his life. The first one being his grandfather. So when Ted's mother gave birth, she didn't have any plan of keeping Ted. She was going to leave him there. But when she returned home without Ted, her parents, so Ted's grandparents, turned around and said, no, bring that little boy back. We will raise him as our own. And so they told everyone that they had adopted Ted. So that would mean that Louise is now Ted's sister and not mother. Sam Cowell, which is Ted's grandfather, had a big alcoholic problem and a shocking temper. So he was always very abusive mentally and physically towards all of the women inside of the home. Now, according to Ted, he was never a victim of his grandfather's violence. There is also no documentation that states that he was abused mentally, physically, or emotionally, but the experience alone, like seeing his grandfather be abusive towards all the women in his house, that would have sure left some damage psychologically. It also would have shaped his view on how he viewed women and how you should treat women as well. So Eleanor, Ted's grandmother, suffered with major depression, and that doesn't surprise me when I wrote that, considering that she was at the hand of abuse 24/7 from her husband. So when Ted was at the age of 4, his mother Louise, so his biological mother, took him and moved him to Tacoma to live with family and friends because she wanted a better life for her son. She didn't want him growing up around her father. So in 1950, they relocated from Burlington, Vermont to Tacoma, Washington. Not too long after this, in 1951, Louise met a man called Johnny Bundy. They met at an adult singles night, and Johnny at the time was a military cook. The two married quickly, and not too long after that, Johnny adopted Ted, giving him the name that we all know today, Ted Bundy. Johnny took Ted in and treated him as if he was his own son, but Ted didn't really like Johnny. Ted believed that Johnny was dim-witted and that his mother could do so much better because he wasn't pulling in the money that she deserved. So financially, there wasn't a lot of money. Either way, this didn't stop Louise and Johnny from going on about their life, and they actually added 4 more kids to the Bundy family, making the little family of 3 into a big family of 7. Ted soon became emotionally unattached, and during his childhood and adolescence, he was described to be a shy and very self-conscious little boy due to a speech impediment that he had, and this caused Ted to stutter quite regularly. During this time, Ted's mother, Louise, had described Ted to be just a normal, active little boy. She didn't see any red flags and nothing stood out. He just seemed normal. The first sign of his crimes actually started in his adolescence, and he soon became what is described as a peeping Tom. So he would stroll along through his neighbourhood and he would masturbate over his naked neighbours, and it eventually controlled his life quite quickly, and it became a nightly routine to go out and stroll along amongst the neighbourhood and masturbate over a small bunch of the same women. So now he was actually just only focusing on a small amount of women. Ted was never caught, and this meant that Louise and no one ever knew. His peers actually described Ted to be an outcast. He apparently never joined in like any school functions. He never dated anyone. Despite back then Ted being a very attractive man. Like, in this time, the way that Ted looked was actually what we would consider a Zac Efron or a Justin Bieber. Like, that was the attractive back then. A lot of people actually described Ted the same way. So Ted had a very different view of what high school and his childhood was. He had made up this crazy story, and he told people this story, and he said this because he wanted to reinvent his life. He wanted to make himself be a better person than what he actually was. So he told people that he was an A student, and he described his life and his family to be a white picket fence family. This was extremely far from the truth, and the family was actually considered a low middle class, and Ted really just wanted to try and reinvent himself. In 1965, at the age of 16, he went to college and he attended the University of Puget Sound. But in 1966, he transferred to the University of Washington in Seattle. Ted soon formed a new persona. He became a confident young man who was highly invested in politics. He started a massive friend group, and the group was all like into politics as well. And he actually started to become really popular. Now, in 1967, at the age of 20, Ted met his first girlfriend, Diane Edwards. So Diane also attended the University of Washington, and she was described to be Ted's dream girl. She was tall, she had long brown hair, and she was upper class. The two apparently travelled quite a lot in what Ted described to be Diane's fancy, expensive car, and they spent a lot of time making out in this car. Ted said, quote, "The relationship I had with Diane had a lasting impact of me. She's a beautifully dressed, beautiful girl, very personable, nice car and nice parents. So for a first girlfriend, you know, it was not so bad." End quote. Ted also said that Diane was out of his league and that he spent most of his time actually trying to impress her and her family, and was constantly trying to get their approval. At the time that he was dating Diane, he was actually working at the Republican candidate of Seattle. And not too long after this, he decided that he wanted to start applying for law schools. And this is where the relationship of Ted and Diane went downhill. Ted wasn't accepted into any of the law schools, and Diane soon after had actually broken up with Ted. It's safe to say that Ted did not appreciate this, because that same year that Diane and him broke up, that's when he started torturing, kidnapping, and murdering young innocent women. Ronald M. Holmes wrote about this situation and said, quote, "Ted Bundy was a predator for any woman who physically resembled Diane. For example, young, white, with long dark hair parted in the middle." End quote. Diane described Ted to be a people's pleaser and who could never ever stand up for himself. In an interview that Diane had, she said, quote, "He wasn't strong, he was not masculine, and if I got mad at him because he did something, he felt apologetic about it. He would not stand up for himself." End quote. So Diane clearly wanted someone who was masculine and who could stand up for themselves and stand up for her, and Ted just was not that person. In 1969, he met his second girlfriend, Elizabeth Clopher. Now, the two met at a college bar, and Elizabeth had a daughter as well. Now, I'm not sure about the history of where the daughter's biological father was, but all I know is at the time that the two met, she had a little girl. Ted actually soon became the father figure for this little girl. So it's safe to say that the relationship between these two was going well. Now, here is where we are going to be talking about the horrible crimes in this case, and I do just want to put a warning out there that some of the things that I talk about are going to be disturbing and quite graphic, and I just want to put that out there. So if this isn't for you, please maybe just come back to this when you're ready. January 4th, 1974. Ted Bundy broke into the apartment of 21-year-old Karen Sparks. She was a University of Washington student. Ted beat her before sexually assaulting her. She unfortunately spent 10 days in a coma, and Karen did actually survive this, but she was left with permanent disabilities. Karen, as we know, was his first known attack. When I was researching this case, Karen's name on some of the articles was also Joni Lenz. So I'm not really sure what her true name is, but they're the two names that popped up. On February 1st, 1974, Ted broke into the apartment of 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy. She was also University of Washington student, and she was Ted's first known murder. Linda Ann Healy was a weather/ski reporter, and her roommate reported that Linda's alarm went off at 5:30 a.m, but she was not there. Reports also say that she was last seen at 12 a.m. Ted had beat her, abducted her, and then murdered her. When police searched the room, there was no signs of foul play besides a small patch of blood on her pillow and mattress. Her remains were later found at the Taylor Mountain site. Donna Gail Manson, aged 19, disappeared from the Evergreen State College campus near Olympia on the 12th of March 1974. Susan Elaine Raincourt, aged 18, disappeared from the campus of Central Washington State College in Ellensburg on the 17th of April 1974. 21-year-old Roberta Catherine Parks disappeared from Oregon State University campus, also on the 17th of April 1974. Brenda Carol Bowl, aged 22, was last seen at the Tavern Inn. She was murdered on the 1st of June 1974. On the 11th of June 1974, 18-year-old Georgiana Hawkson disappeared on a Monday evening after she left the Beta House at the University of Washington. She was returning to her house, which is about half a block from the Beta House, and she was never seen again. Her remains were never found. At this time, Ted actually met a girl called Carol Ann Boone. And whilst they were both working at the Department of Emergency Services, the two dated, but to Carol Ann's knowledge, Ted was actually dating Liz as well. So throughout all of this, Ted's still dating Liz. So in the last 6 months, there had been 6 unknown disappearances. In 1974, a lot of people were actually hitchhiking. It was quite normal to do that. But panic spread so quickly that it actually became way too dangerous. Somewhere in the middle of 1974, Ted moved to Salt Lake City, Utah. And he did this so he could enroll in the Utah Law School. 1 month after he arrived, women started going missing everywhere. Now, you might think, oh, this is just a coincidence. But if it was a coincidence, we wouldn't be talking about this case right now. July 14th, 1974, 2 young women actually went missing in Lake Sammamish State Park. Denise Naslin, aged 18, and Janice Ott, 23, disappeared from Lake Sammamish Park. And this was the first time that investigators actually had some good evidence and eyewitnesses. People had told police that Throughout the day, they had seen a man in a sling approach young women, asking the women to help him load up his sailboat. This man was Ted Bundy. This tactic did unfortunately work on two innocent girls. Denise Naslin was laying on the beach with some friends and she went to the restroom, and that's when Ted approached her. She willingly went with Ted to help him, and this was the last time that she was ever seen. Janice Ott was also laying on the beach when Ted approached her and asked her if she could help him. Now, she agreed, and a witness actually overheard a conversation that the two were having, and the conversation actually revealed Ted's name, and this is how it went. Janice, hi, I'm Janice. Ted, hi, I'm Ted. So Ted told Janice his real name, which when I read this I was a bit confused, because what if this person got away? Like, you've literally just told them your name. But anyway. After this, Janice was never seen again. That day, reports came in that the man that was seen with both Janice and Denise was driving a Volkswagen Bug, which at the time wasn't strange because in the year of 1974, there were 42,000 bugs. On August 8th, 1974, a call came in from a woman saying that she was concerned about her boyfriend. She was later found out to be Elizabeth, Ted's girlfriend. The sketch and description of the guy matched perfectly with Ted, and she had told police that at the time, Ted was apparently acting very strange, and he actually told her that he was following sorority girls and how she had also found a bag of women's underwear, a bowl of house keys and some plaster of Paris and bandages at his house. She also said that she had found a knife under his car. At this time, a lot of women were calling up and reporting about their boyfriends being suspicious, and police eventually did narrow the list down to 100 people, but that's still a lot of people. But Ted fitted perfectly with the portfolio, and Ted was eventually questioned, and he could not give a solid alibi on the days that these girls had gone missing, and he actually became a prime suspect. Now, he believed that he was being targeted, but he also didn't know who tipped him in. On October 2nd, 1974, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox vanished from her home. Her body was never found. 2 weeks later, on the 18th of October, 17-year-old Melissa Smith, a local police chief's daughter, went missing. 9 days later, on the 27th of October, Melissa's body was found in the Summit County. Her body had been beaten and she'd been strangled with a nylon stocking. On October 31st, Laura Amy also vanished, and she was unfortunately later found in the Wasatch Mountains. She had been bludgeoned and raped. The police in Utah at this point haven't connected the murders and the disappearances to the ones in Seattle. We need to remember that this is in 1974, and it's not as easy as what it is these days to make contact with the other states. The only way that they could really do that is through airmail or through telephone, but even then that wasn't the best. On November 8th, 1974, 18-year-old Carol Durant was at a mall. Now, Carol was looking at a bookshop when a man who was saying that he was a police officer had approached her and had said that he was police officer Roseland, and that someone had just broken into Carol's car and asked her to follow him out to her car to see if anything had gone missing. Now, the two make it out to Carol's car, and she's looking around, and there's not anything that catches her eye to be missing. And she had told Officer Roseland that nothing's missing and that it's all fine. He kept leaning forward, implying that just take a more in-depth look in her car. And she said to the officer repetitively, there's nothing missing in my car. The officer eventually was like, okay, but we want you to come down and make like a formal complaint against him, because they were holding him down at the police station. Carol at this point started to feel like very uneasy, so she actually asked him to like show some sort of identification, and without hesitation, this man whipped out a badge and showed her. She did this because she thought that she could smell alcohol on his breath, and considering what had happened in the town across from her, she was wary of the situation. Carol did identify that the car he drove was a Volkswagen Bug, and at the time she thought it was a little bit suspicious, but then she's like, maybe he's just undercover. When they got in the car, the man turned down a side street and parked his car up on a side curb, and Carol really quite quickly realised that something was up. This is not what he said he was going to be doing. She thought that they were going down to the police station. But before she could act on her thoughts, the man grabbed her wrists and he tried to handcuff her, but he only managed to get on one wrist. He pulled out a gun and said, quote, "I'll blow your head off." Carol said at this point that she was telling him inside her head to just do it. She wanted him to do it. But Carol soon found the strength and she jumped out of the car. He raced after her and the two had a struggle, and at this point the man had a crowbar and he was trying to hit her over the head with it. Carol noticed that a car started coming in the other direction, and Carol broke free and she ran to that car. She flew the door open and jumped in, and in a state of like stress and panic, she was like, "Take me to the police station. Take me to the police station." She was begging them. The man that had just tried to kidnap and kill her was Ted Bundy. And unfortunately, Carol later found out that Ted was so angry that she escaped that he went and he got another young, innocent woman and he killed her. Only 4 hours after attempting to kill Carol Durant, Ted went and killed 17-year-old Deborah Kent. Deborah was at a play at Vermont High School, and she left early to go and pick up her little brother, but unfortunately she never made it to her car. In the parking lot, police had found like a handcuff key, and at this point Carol still had the handcuff on her arm, and when the key was matched up with the handcuff on Carol's arm, it was a match. This was a massive key to finding who did this, because not only was there an eyewitness who looked at him, but there was also a connection between Carol and Deborah. On March 5th, 1975, at Taylor Mountain in Washington State, a group of foresters were marking some trees when they had come across a human skull. This skull belonged to Brenda Boll. The police started a search, and this is where they found the remains of 6 other girls. Only 100 feet from Brenda, they found 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy, and 18-year-old Susanna Raincott, and 21-year-old Roberta Parks. A few miles away, they also found the remains of 23-year-old Janice Ott and 18-year-old Denise Naslin. Even though these women had been abducted at different times and locations, they were all found at the same place, which led police to believe that they were actually dealing with a serial killer. At the time of 1974 and 1975, the term serial killer was not used very often. In fact, I don't think that it actually was even on the police's mind until right now. Soon it had hit the media, and a journalist in Colorado named Ward Lucas soon realized that there was a problem with missing girls in multiple states. So we're going back here a little bit, but in January 12, 1975, Karen Campbell, aged 23, had disappeared from the Woodland Inn in Colorado. She was actually here staying with her fiance. At around 8 p.m. that night, she wanted to go and get a magazine from her room. So she headed up to the second floor, and that was the last time that anyone had seen her. 36 days later, her naked body was found about 3 miles away. The body had been attacked by animals, but the coroner could discover that it was Karen and that she had died about 2 hours after dinner. Two more women went missing in Colorado, and they were 26-year-old Julie Cunningham from Vail, and she died March 15th, 1975, and 24-year-old Denise Olverson from Grand Junction. She had been missing since April 6th, 1975. The police now are convinced that they were somehow related to the other missing girls in Seattle and Utah. And on April 15th, 1975, Melanie Cooley, aged 18, was murdered. Ted has always been suspected of this murder, but he had never confessed to it. So there was a lot of women who were suspected of being the victim of Ted Bundy, but he actually only admitted to a few of them. On May 6, 1975, 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Clopher went missing. She has never been found. On June 27, 1975, Suzanne Curtis, age 15, went missing, and she also has never been found. One night in August 1975, a highway patrol officer named Bob Halen saw a Volkswagen Bug driving down the street with his lights off. This obviously was a red flag, and it was quite suspicious, so the man attempted to pull over this person, and it resulted in a high-speed police chase. Eventually, Bob was actually able to get the driver to stop, and the man was arrested soon after for failing to stop, and he was soon identified to be Ted Bundy. Ted did ask for a lawyer, and that's when he called Brew Lerbeck. John O'Connell was the other lawyer who actually eventually became the lead counsel. Soon after this, Bruce was called in by prosecutors because they wanted to talk to him about Ted. They believed that Ted was involved in more than what he was saying he was. Ted was like, yeah, I'm just guilty of not pulling over when I was being arrested, but everyone else kind of believed that it was something more sinister. When Ted got pulled over, police searched his car, and in his car they found a brown gym bag, and in this bag they found some items that were very suspicious. So they found a ski mask, an ice pick, some strips of torn sheets, a pry bar, pantyhose, and some handcuffs. They were all suspicious of Ted, and he had matched the description of the man who kidnapped Carol Durant. Ted was brought in for a lineup, but at the time they couldn't find anyone of the public who was willing to participate. And they needed people who looked like Ted because they were certain that Ted was the person who kidnapped Carol. So the only people that they could find was law enforcement officers. So they did set Ted up, but if Ted was innocent, then it wouldn't have been a problem. When Ted was put up in this lineup, he had completely changed his appearance from the day before that he was arrested. And so Ted wanted to make himself look different. When Carol was shown all the men, she immediately pointed out Ted, and she said, "That is the man who kidnapped me." Ted was charged with attempting to kidnap Carol Durant. A newspaper article was made, and it made headlines, and it said, "Is Utah Ted Seattle Ted?" This article got law enforcement thinking very hard, and this is when all the states finally started talking and they put all their evidence together. Now, I'm not 100% sure if this is true, but September of 1975, Ted had apparently sold his car that had later been brought into forensics testing, and in the car they had found hair that directly traced back to some of the missing girls. Like I said, I'm not really sure if it's true, but I did want to add that in there. Everyone who knew Ted, including the people that was at his church, believed that he was 100% innocent. On February 26, 1976, the trial of Carol Durant started. Ted becomes heavily involved in this case, but throughout the whole trial, Ted kept up his charismatic, handsome, innocent composure. According to Carol, Ted's defense team was trying their absolute hardest to try and confuse her in any way possible. They believed that they could actually win the case because Carol wasn't very certain of herself. At trial, Carol was asked if the man who tried to kidnap was in the room, and she replied yes. She was then asked to point to the man, and she pointed directly at Ted. This actually made Ted extremely angry, and he got up and pointed at Carol and the judge and said, quote, "She is lying, she's lied before, she's lying now," end quote. At trial, Ted was convicted of attempted kidnapping of Carol Durant. He was actually given a 30-day evaluation. I've never heard of this before, so I did some researching. And this just meant that Ted was going to be evaluated for 30 days, and he was assessed on whether he's dangerous enough to go to prison or if he could be put on probation. Ted had mentioned that the psychologist that was doing this examination was an asshole. So Ted didn't like him, but what a surprise. Dr. Carlisle spoke to his family and friends and even some ex-girlfriends. This is where apparently one girl who said that Ted actually had a dark side. She told Dr. Carlisle that they went swimming one day at the beach and he had grabbed her head and shoved her head under the water and he held it there. He then let her breathe for a few seconds and then he did it again. She was certain that Ted was trying to kill her that day. Dr. Carlisle also found out that at the age of 14, Ted found his birth certificate, where the spot of the father was, it was at that point unknown. Dr. Carlisle said that even though Ted had told him that it didn't affect him, that it would have left a mark on Ted. The last time Dr. Carlisle and Ted spoke, Ted asked him, "Do you think I killed those girls?" Which is strange because they'd never ever spoken about those murders. Dr. Carlisle replied and said, quote, "I don't know, but I think if you did, you'd do it again." Ted apparently looked at him and walked back into his cell. Dr. Carlisle submitted his application to the judge, and in his opinion, he felt that, quote, "The above personality profile is consistent with the personality of violence and is consistent with the nature of the crime for which he is convicted. Therefore, I cannot comfortably say that he is a good risk if placed on probation." End quote. Ted was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. At the age of 25, Ted was a Republican campaign worker in Seattle. At the age of 28, he was a University of Utah student. And now at the age of 29, Ted was a convicted Utah kidnapper. October 21st, 1976, Ted was in the visiting room of the prison when 3 men walked into the room and told Ted that they had a warrant for his arrest. The warrant for his arrest was for the murder of Carol Campbell in Colorado. There was substantial evidence that placed Ted directly at the Snowmass Inn, which was where Karen was staying. A search warrant of Ted Bundy's house shows a brooch from the Snowmass, and there was also fuel records that placed Ted only a few miles off where Karen was. A witness also came forward and said that they had seen Ted in the elevator with Karen the day she went missing. He was charged with first-degree murder with premeditation. At this time, the offense carried the death penalty. Utah officials allowed Ted to be extradited back to Colorado. He was placed in Aspen awaiting his trial. Ted's demeanor started to crack at this point, and he went from the gentle, kind man to an incredibly angry, short-tempered person who had a massive ego.